All right, thank you everybody for coming for the second round of the panel on critical race theory, the law, and education. My name is Dr. Jeremiah Augustus Chin. I'm here at the St. Thomas University College of Law in Miami, Florida. And I'm very happy to present two brilliant scholars today, Professor Ian Haney-Lopez, who is the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Public Law at the University of California, Berkeley. His scholarship focuses on how racism has evolved since the civil rights era, including research on the connection between worsening contemporary racism and the rise of American plutocracy. With the support of unions and foundations for the last decade, Professor Haney-Lopez has been running focus groups, deep surveys, and message testing. His findings have appeared in the New York Times and Washington Post, among other places, and also feature in his book, Dog Whistle Politics, published in 2014, as well as the book Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America, published in 2019. Professor Haney-Lopez is also the author of White by Law, one of my personal favorites, as well as Racism on Trial, books that respectively critique the legal construction of white and Latinx racial identity. I'm also happy to be joined by Professor Emily Ho, who is the Gustavus Henry Wald Professor of the Law and Contracts at the University of Cincinnati College of Law, where she teaches contracts, commercial law, labor law, and critical race theory. She is five-time winner of the Goldman Prize for Excellence in Teaching, and much of Professor Ho's past and current scholarship focuses on the interplay between contract law and critical race theory, appearing in numerous law journals and edited collections. And she is a co-editor, along with Professor Devin Carbato and Professor Kiara Bridges, of the forthcoming Oxford University Press Handbook on Race and the Law in the United States, with some of her recent work speaking extensively on issues related to legislative, quote, educational gag orders, which attempt to prohibit the teaching of so-called divisive concepts, which is kind of the host of our conversation today. So I'm very happy to be joined by both of you. But in the spirit of critical race theory and the emphasis on personal storytelling, I want to go back to the past and think about how everyone has arrived at critical race theory, or how you got involved in critical race theory as a personal story or as a framework, or, you know, what brought you to critical race theory in the first place. I'll start with Emily.
Okay, hi, thank you, Jeremiah. I also want to thank the organizers of this amazing conference, Dr. Dancy, for the invitation, and the last panel, which was phenomenal and did a lot of work to sort of frame the things that we're going to be talking about. But in terms of the personal story, and Jeremiah, thank you for creating the space to tell our stories a little bit. So in terms of formal education, I came to CRT through a fairly, typical channels. I was an Asian American Studies major in college. I started reading critical race theory as a first-year law student in law school, and doing that literally prevented me from dropping out of law school, to be perfectly frank. In law school, I co-founded the Michigan Journal of Race and Law with some brilliant classmates and friends who are now also, many of whom are also colleagues now in the academy. That's kind of how I came to it formally. But if I may, I want to say a little bit more about my sort of personal experience and history, and how that sort of started me down this path. So just this past weekend, I attended in Detroit the Vincent Chin 40th Remembrance and Rededication program or event. Again, it was in Detroit, near the campus of Wayne State University, where my dad actually taught mathematics from the time he immigrated with my mom in 1967, thanks to the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, which of course ended discriminatory immigration quotas in favor of less discriminatory preference system. Detroit, of course, is also where Vincent Chin was beaten to death with a baseball bat by two white unemployed auto workers on June 19th, 1982. And, significantly, June 19th is also Juneteenth. I don't know how much of the Vincent Chin story people know or don't know. And I think one thing that became really apparent even over the weekend was that too few people sort of know that story. But it has become really relevant again because of the rise in anti-Asian violence as a result of the pandemic of COVID and other things. But Vincent Chin was a Chinese American who was out at a strip club for his bachelor party. Two white out of work auto workers they got into a verbal altercation, during which, one of the white auto workers said to Vincent Chin, "It's because of you little motherfuckers that we're out of work." And Chin sort of objected to that quite assertively. They got in a fight in the bar. They got kicked out of the bar. And following that, the two white auto workers actually stalked Vincent Chin running through the neighborhood, chased him down, finally caught up with him in front of a McDonald's on a major sort of throughway in Detroit. And one held him down while the other beat him in the head. Like, according to witnesses, he was going for a home run. And Chin was, he was hospitalized, and 4 days after that, he died. And when the two auto workers, they pled guilty to reduced charges of manslaughter, and the judge sentenced them to about $3,000 in fines and 3 years of probation, stating in the sentencing that these two were not the kind of men who should go to jail. Notably, no assistant prosecutor was at the sentencing hearing to object to this or have anything to say about this. And friends and family of Vincent Chin were not notified about the sentencing hearing at the time. This really galvanized actually the Chinese American community in Detroit and the surrounding area at the time. And it was a big deal. And my mom actually joined in. She joined this group, the American Citizens for Justice, to sort of protest and advocate for the saying became justice for Vincent Chin. This gave rise to sort of local and what eventually became a national grassroots sort of movement for justice for Vincent Chin. And it became a very sort of multiracial coalition as well. I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more to say about what eventually ended up happening to the killers of Vincent Chin, but I just want to say that it was through my mom that I came to do this work. I would go to meetings with her. She got put in charge of the ACJ newsletter. I folded a lot of newsletters. I put address labels on a lot of these newsletters and kind of became familiar with sort of racial injustice through that work. And even though at the time I was not really, I was 11, I didn't really understand, I think, in a really deep sense what was happening. But I do want to credit my mom, actually, for bringing me here to my work in critical race theory. So that's my story.
Wow. Wow, Emily, that's thank you for bringing the story of Vincent Chin to life and connecting it with your own experiences and how you got here. It was really powerful. Thank you also to Jeremiah for bringing us in as people, introducing us to the audience as people, or allowing us the space to do so with these stories. Let me start this way. For myself, I think my engagement with race began here in Hawaii, where I grew up. My mother's an immigrant from El Salvador. My father's white from Spokane, Washington. In Hawaii, there were very few Latinos when I was growing up. So my identity was what was called Hapa Haole. So Haole means white and Hapa means mixed. And there are a lot of us who are mixed something with white. And it's just, it's a pervasive identity. one thing that really helped growing up in Hawaii was that we talk about race all the time. Um, to use fancier vocabulary, we're incredibly racialist in the sense that everybody's talking about race as a socially salient characteristic. But I want to distinguish between racialist and racist, in which people are drawing on ideas of race to assert a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority. Racism of the hierarchical, dehumanizing sort was, not widespread. In contrast to the racialism, the sort of, hey, that person's Haole, that person's Chinese, that person's Hawaiian, that sort of conversation was widespread. This tendency to talk about race all the time, was a very important part of bringing me to critical race theory. But I'm about to leave Hawaii, like in terms of my story and then also metaphorically. But before I do, I want to be absolutely clear. Hawaii very much has a racist history, the history of colonialism, the history of intentionally using race as a divide and conquer tactic on the part of plantation owners. There is intense racism in Hawaii. I am not at all claiming that Hawaii is a sort of a racial paradise or a racial nirvana, but that said, I do want to sort of hold on to this idea that there's a different culture around race, and that is a culture here of talking about it all the time. So I leave here and I go to St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis, Missouri is incredibly segregated, white and black. The racism of a hierarchy of white over black is intense. It's evident. It's built into the material and the cultural and the social reality of the place, and nobody was talking about it. That, that was deeply confusing to me, that you couldn't talk about white and black. You couldn't name what was so evidently structuring society. Now, here's the other dynamic. I, as this kid from Hawaii, was being pushed into the white and black paradigm. And sometimes this took the form of what I came later to understand as honorary whiteness. And this is a dynamic in which people aren't sure what to do with me, so they adopt an etiquette of pretending that I'm white. So that, to give an example, first day in class, and the professor would call roll, and then he would look up from the roll to sort of put a face to the name. And when that would happen with me, there would always be that sort of double take, right? Like, it's like, you're Ian Haney. And at this time, I hadn't yet added Lopez to my last name. So I was Ian Haney, with Haney as my father's surname. So it's like, you're Ian Haney. It's like, you're not really coding it the way this sort of Irish sounding name would suggest. But because of my accent, because of my education, my accent being sort of middle class, Midwestern educated, right? Like, ABC Nightly News, PBS type of accent in an academic setting. Because of my education, because of my competence in the classroom, eventually the professors would come to understand me and treat me as white. At the same time, some of my classmates reacted to me negatively. The sort of, door closed in my face, the classroom door closed in my face with the student saying, "Go back where you came from," which, at this point, I'm like in St. Louis and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I would give anything to go back to Hawaii. How'd I end up here? But I had those sorts of experiences. I had the experiences of being stopped by the police. One of those instances in particular, I was on I was doing a summer internship, a semester internship in Washington, D.C., and I happened to be in Baltimore, and I was stopped by the Baltimore police, and they were very, very aggressive initially, and asked for ID and what are you doing here, boy, and all that sort of language. And then I showed them my Hawaii driver's license, and the cops shifted from this aggressive stance to, Hawaii, I love it. I went there on my honeymoon, da 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 da. And it was an eye-opening moment for me, because I really came to understand my identity, the way I was being seen, the way I was being placed racially was bouncing back and forth. And um, things that seemed to have nothing to do with race, the way I spoke English, my academic competence, a Hawaii driver's license, they were actually driving, they were playing an enormous role in how I was being placed racially. So that sometimes I was placed in the subordinate category of dark and dangerous and other and potentially violent. But then other times I was placed in a superordinate category of competent and educable and smart and deserving of dignity and respect, right? So the operating within a liminal identity, right? Half white, half Latino, in black and white spaces made crystal clear to me the way in which race was being socially rather than biologically determined. And it was this idea of race as socially, not biologically determined, that I really carried with me to Harvard Law School, which is the first place I was able to formally study race and racism, which I continue to think that's remarkable. By the time I got to Harvard Law School, I already had a master's degree in modern American history. I'd already finished a year of public policy at Princeton, and yet I had not in those settings had an opportunity to formally study race and racism. It was only through Harvard Law School, taking classes with Derek Bell as well as with Randy Kennedy, that I was really able to study race and racism. And in that context, my focus became the social construction of race. My first article is called The Social Construction of Race. My first book, White by Law, is about the specifically legal ways in which courts and lawyers participate in the construction of a cultural certainty that race is real and biological. So that, I think that really brought me in. I have a lot more to say, or let me sort of signal where I think the conversation will go. Studying the social construction of race exposed me to a bunch of folks who then said, well, if race is social, it's not real. And if it's not real, it's not socially relevant. And I really pushed in the opposite direction and went from talking about the social construction of race to talking about racism and its social origins and its social functions. And I think the functional aspect, what work is race and racism doing in our society? That's really become my focus. And I think over the last 10 years, as I've studied the role of racism in American electoral politics, my main focus has been on understanding the function of racism, the work it's doing, who benefits from it, who loses, and in which ways. So I very much continue to be a student of the social construction of race, with two important caveats. I don't mean race is an illusion. I mean it's incredibly powerful and it remains powerful today. And second important caveat, or second important point to emphasize, we are as a society actively constructing, and some of us actively contesting, the creation of racial categories right now. The social construction of race is not something that happened a century ago, and this is just inertia. We as a society are actively constructing race right now. Some people intentionally, strategically, in a way that benefits them. Many of us sort of trapped in this sort of myth making that convinces a lot of us to fear and fight each other.
Thank you both for sharing such beautiful personal stories to lead us into our topics today. And I think, for me personally, getting involved with critical race theory started with articles by critical race scholars like yourselves who were established in the field. I grew up in Utah, so it was very different from Hawaii, very different from Detroit in a lot of ways, where race is not talked about at all. And so then to get involved with critical race scholarship and see discussions about race happening in not just, plain ways, but also critical ways was so important. And critical race theory for me was an inspiration to continue a conversation. So to flip side that and to think about the active construction of race in our modern times, why do you both think that the focus has now turned to critical race theory itself? Why that label? Why that brand for attacks, as Dorothy Roberts and Cheryl Harris put in the previous panel so well, just general broad-based attacks on anti-racism or anti-racist work? Why do you think critical race theory become kind of this linchpin target point? And I'll start with Ian on this one.
So I think critical race theory, or let me back up a little bit. With the success of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the success, listen, some successes, some limitations, but one thing that the civil rights movement was undeniably successful in doing was creating a widely endorsed cultural common sense that racism is ugly and immoral and should be repudiated. And so, and now obviously there's going to be a lot of debate about what racism is, but the most egregious examples, using racial epithets like the N-word, openly proclaiming that whites are superior and that other groups are inferior, openly mocking somebody's physical features, right? Like that very narrow definition of racism. It became cultural common sense that that was immoral, that a person who said those sorts of things was benighted and backwards. What did that do to American politics? Well, American politics, from the debates over the foundation of the country, about the formation of the Union, right up through the civil rights movement, American politics has always fundamentally been about race. It's been about the tension between free whites and a system of economic slavery. It's been about the place of Native Americans, the role of expansion. It's been about empire. How much of Mexico could the United States take without polluting the American population? How dramatically could the United States be an empire with power over Puerto Rico and Cuba and the Philippines and Guam, but at the same time not extend the Constitution and importantly, constitutional citizenship and equality to these new colonial subjects, right? The conversations, the American political conversation has always been about the special place of whites vis-a-vis people of color and the political and economic systems used to manage and exploit people of color. It's always been central to American politics. Does that disappear in the 1960s when it becomes culturally accepted that open endorsements of white supremacy and the superior position of whites is now immoral and tainted? It doesn't. It goes underground. It develops a new language that is on its surface not about race at all, but about abstractions, about abstract principles, but that function to preserve a dominant position for whites and to provide an alternative, seemingly neutral, seemingly legitimate vocabulary for white racial anxiety. And so I'm thinking about terms like states' rights in the 1960s. States' rights, if you take it at its surface, is about appropriate federal-state relations. Yet everybody understood in the 1960s it meant a critique of the federal government's insistence that the South stop humiliating and degrading African Americans through its segregation laws. Or a term like freedom of association, a philosophical concept saying that one of the highest values of a human being is the autonomy of choices and who we associate with. Seriously, right? Why would freedom of association become a main main form of campaign rhetoric in the 1960s, because people at the time understood that what freedom of association really meant in practice was the right of whites to continue to segregate, to discriminate against African Americans. And let me emphasize this, because we lose this sort of aspect of what segregation is about when we simply talk about it as segregation, as separation. Segregation is about hierarchy. It's about group degradation. It's about individual humiliation. And freedom of association meant the right of whites to continue to degrade African Americans as a group, to humiliate them as individuals. But again, it's got this sort of this facade of neutrality, this facade of principle. Freedom of association, shouldn't we all have this? Let me connect it up with comments from the previous panel. Parental choice, parental rights. This sounds like, well, of course, it's race neutral on its face. And yet I think Dorothy Roberts was correct when she said it's not applied in a sort of neutral, even-handed, consistent way. It's not as if these principles are principles that people actually care about qua principles, that they just want to make sure that they're enforced evenly and across the board. Rather, these principles are doing racial work or racist work. They're providing a veneer of legitimacy to a sort of a purposeful, intensive effort to maintain the dominance of whites, and then to provide a gloss of neutrality to what is really a discourse of white anxiety and white racial fear. Okay, so how can we talk about this? I use the phrase dog whistle politics, right? So a dog whistle as a metaphor, a literal dog whistle, sounds at a register too high for human ears to pick up, but audible to canines, right? And so this is this metaphor of political speech, which is silent on one level, silent about race on one level, but designed to trigger strong racial reactions on another. Dog whistle politics, I think, has been the single most important factor driving shifts in American electoral politics, and in turn, reshaping our economy and putting our democracy in jeopardy over the last 50 years. We can talk in more detail about how that happens and the ramifications of dog whistle politics. But to come back to this question of attacks on critical race theory, there have been two principal sorts of dog whistles since the 1960s, one of which I call the threat script. And so the threat script is a vocabulary that implies people of color are pathologically dangerous and violent. So think about thugs, law and order, gangbangers, super predators, criminal illegal aliens, terrorists. On the surface, none of these terms reference race, but all of them conjure an image of pathologically violent and dangerous people of color, right? So that's the threat script. There's also what I term the scarcity script. It's a way of communicating that the reason people are struggling is because undeserving people of color are grabbing more than their fair share. So for example, welfare queen. The image of the welfare queen, again, race neutral on its surface, but the image there is of lazy and larcenous Black people, Black women in particular, who would rather rip off the system than do an honest day's work. And ostensibly, it's because of welfare queens that decent, hardworking, law-abiding, tax-paying Americans are struggling, because so much of what they need is actually being consumed by these undeserving people, these people who treat a way up as instead a hammock in the language that Paul Ryan tends to use. Think also, for example, of the rhetoric that says that the reason there's a healthcare crisis is because illegal aliens are flooding our hospitals and consuming all of those resources, right? Okay, those are the two main scripts. Something changes with the massive multiracial protests that occur in the wake of George Floyd's slow motion murder, right? So after George Floyd's murder and after The American public sees, relives, experiences the intense slow motion horror of that execution. There is, by some measures, the largest, most racially integrated, most geographically widespread civil rights protests in the history of the country. And the right responds by creating a new racial script. And it's what I call the revenge script, or the racial revenge script. What is the racial revenge script? It is the claim that those people interested in racial justice are not, in fact, interested in justice. They're actually pursuing revenge. They don't want equality. They want an inverted hierarchy in which people of color will be dominant and whites will be the new inferior, subordinated, victimized race. Now, one thing to be very clear, this is new in terms of political speech, but very old in terms of white racial imagination. The notion of racial revenge really goes back to the days of slavery. So many of the justifications for slavery were rooted in the idea that you needed violence, you needed complete control, you needed thoroughgoing suppression and oppression of African Americans because they were by their nature bestial and violent. And if they weren't controlled, they would tend towards criminality and towards the rape of white women, right? So you always had this sort of racial oppression is necessary because racial equality is not possible. Those people can never be our equals. In fact, they threaten to impose control over us. Some group must be on top. It should be white people and not those beastly, dangerous others. So that the notion of racial justice as, in fact, a cover for racial revenge is deeply rooted in American racial common sense. But in politics, it's a new threat script, or it's a new sort of dog whistle script. And what form does it take? Initially, it takes the form of attacks on Black Lives Matter. And the claim is, when people say Black Lives Matter, they don't mean Black lives should also matter. They mean only Black lives matter, white lives don't matter. So that Black Lives Matter is transmuted, transmogrified from being a claim of equality and humanity and decency into a purported insistence on racial supremacy of Black people over white people. It then also takes the form of attacks on the 1619 Project, on the idea that an engagement with America's racial history is really an effort to oppress white people, to make them feel bad, to stain them with the taint of guilt and responsibility for slavery, to preach a hatred of America, an anti-patriotic hatred of America, right? So you see all of the sort of attacks on 1619, and indeed you see Trump responding that we should have a patriotic education, presumably one that whitewashes the history of slavery. In this context, critical race theory becomes another foci of attack. And this sort of happens originally because of sort of a right-wing entrepreneur, Christopher Rufo, who's searching around for ways in which he can express the racial revenge script, build on hysteria about Black Lives Matter and the 1619 Project. And he happens on critical race theory. And as he says, it's got all these different elements that the American public hates or can be made to hate. It talks expressly about race. It has the word critical. It's lodged in law schools and academia and in elite institutions. And he says, look, we can take all of those things and we can, and he actually boasts about this, we can strip critical race theory of its actual meaning, the actual practice of critical race theory in law schools, and instead imbue it with all the sorts of social craziness that the right insists is actually out there. people teaching hatred, people teaching young children to hate themselves or to hate their classmates on the basis of skin color, people teaching children to seek to lift themselves up as people of color and push whites down, that he was just going to imbue all of that. He's going to inject all of that under the label of critical race theory. So critical race theory becomes this convenient catch-all to express this idea of racial revenge. Rufo is invited onto Tucker Carlson's show. Trump happens to be watching the morning after he appears on Carlson's show. Mark Meadows calls him, says, White House is really interested in this idea. How can we lift it up? And the Trump administration issues a presidential directive saying 3 great threats in the history of the United States: communism, fascism, and critical race theory. Right? So it's the whole. I mean, and so in one sense, the attacks on critical race theory, serendipity. It has nothing to do with what's actually being taught in critical race theory, with any sort of genuine or good faith engagement with critical race theory. But on another level, this is part of a 50-year intense effort to provide a vocabulary that simultaneously defends white dominance and also provides a seemingly neutral language in which people can express white racist fears and anxieties.
Well, and Ian, you raised so many excellent points to give us this beautiful history of the kind of build up to the attacks on critical race theory, but you really highlight the function, as you said in your first comment, the function of racism, practically. And so, Emily, I wanted to ask you about what you've seen in these kind of educational gag order bills, or referred to as backlash bills, the anti-critical race theory legislation that we've seen coming up so much and so often. How do we see this history manifesting once the state legislatures get their hand on this kind of serendipitous, coincidental, but also highly motivated attack tactic?
Yeah, well, before I jump into the sort of nuts and bolts of the legislation, first, Ian, thank you for that really brilliant exposition of sort of what's really going on here and where it fits in historically. And I especially appreciate your reference to, the project of American Empire, right? And how that has been so important, in all of this. But I want to shift a little bit and talk about, sort of the history of anti-intellectualism in the United States and the role that is playing here, and how sort of politicians now, or the right, really understands that and recognizes that, as Ian was talking about Christopher Rufo and, the conservative think tank that he's from. But I think to really make sense of these attacks, we have to situate and we have to understand them as part of an American tradition, historical tradition, in which intellectualism and anti-intellectualism have coexisted and sometimes even overlapped since, the founding of the United States as a nation. And so in the colonies, it took the form of, New World Puritan religiosity, as opposed to, the secular enlightenment of the founding fathers. And both Cheryl and Dorothy sort of talked about this also on the last panel, and sort of the fallacy of those things. But in tracing the history of anti-intellectualism, Richard Hofstadter, of course, in his classic Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, identified 2 sort of steady and primary forces of anti-intellectualism. One being what he called evangelical religion, and the other simply being business. And we, in more modern terms, I would call those things, those 2 forces are still here, and I would refer to them as evangelical denialism and really racial capitalism. And both of these forces foreground today's attacks, political attacks, cultural attacks, cultural and political attacks on critical race theory, which is really, as Ian pointed out, I think really well, a stand-in for so many other things. Also calling them, saying divisive concepts. So of course, we're in a period of really intense and brutal and oppressive anti-intellectualism in response, as Ian mentioned, to this global, right, racial reckoning that was starting to take place. But I think we've actually been in this period for some time. And in my opinion, at least since the mid or late 1970s, at least since Nixon and beyond, when some of the successes of the modern civil rights and student activist movements started to visibly pay off. And by that, I mean when more and more people of color, women, working and lower income people, queer people, when they began to gain access, in particular to public post-secondary education, as well as K through 12 education. So from this, I really believe, among other things, this sort of nation anti-tax movement begins to emerge. And their aim was, and I think it still is, and again, this was referenced in the last panel too, they really aim in part to recharacterize public education, not as a public and collective good worthy of the support of taxpayers, but as a private choice, right? As parental choice. And in the higher ed context, which is where my expertise is, we see this most significantly in how resources are being distributed within the university, right? Increasingly away from what kind of instruction and coursework and academic experience is best for students, and more toward whether what we're doing will result in sort of the generation of revenue, because you know what? Even public universities don't get any public support anymore financially. So education is, of course, right, the central institutional countervailing force to anti-intellectualism. And as a result, education itself has been continually subject to anti-intellectual attack on all fronts and in many different forms, right? Political, cultural, socioeconomic, and legal. And they've taken different forms in history. For example, as anti-literacy laws, making it illegal for enslaved or free people of color to read and write, right? As panicked McCarthyism of the 1940s and 50s, as opposition to teaching sex ed in the public schools, or of course, to legislative efforts to prohibit the teaching of critical race, quote unquote, critical race theory and divisive concepts, or, as we're referring to them, educational gag orders. So these attacks have always aimed to obstruct intellectualism. And here I want to define that the way I'm using that word is as it means the process of producing and transmitting knowledge for the betterment and progression of society, and in particular, a multiracial democracy. These attacks have always been seeded and sowed by the ruling classes, most benefited by socioeconomic hierarchy, as I think Ian and Cheryl and Dorothy and Fauna have all kind of discussed, right? Whether those ruling classes are slaveholders and traders, or political and corporate Civil War, Cold War defenders of sort of American style capitalism, whether they're small p puritanical evangelists defending, the kinds of family units and family values that best serve a certain form of capitalism, whether it's anti-taxpayers who are hell-bent on defunding public education, or right-wing movements funded by dark money to sort of control the kind of knowledge produced in universities and the kind of knowledge that teachers can teach in the classroom. And here I want to, this was also discussed in the very first panel this morning by Dr. Douglas. So when you consider all of these things, I know this is a long answer to your question, but when we consider all of these things in the broader context of what has been happening politically and culturally, right? Again, references have been made here to voter suppression, to the rise of racialized violence perpetrated by the state and individuals enabled by the state, by the elimination of what we used to consider essential for the public good, the collective good, by the militarization of our police forces, by the successes of the stunning successes of the anti-labor and anti-union movements, since the mid 20th century, and certainly by the state's ever-growing commitment to the well-being and growth of corporations. We can see how these legislative attacks on CRT and on the teaching of a truthful history are part of and even essential to projects to preserve and fortify inequity and inequality, right? They can talk about it as if what they're talking about is equality, freedom, but it's actually really the opposite of that. And in that sense, I refer back to the conversation in the earlier panel about sort of meaning, right? The meaning of language and terms. This also goes to, Ian's work on dogmatal politics and all of this, that, it's a struggle over the meaning of, again, what things like equality mean, freedom mean, liberty, things like that. So I think that's really what is behind the sort of legislative attacks. But, as we've all kind of discussed, it's really part of a piece of American history. It's nothing new, it's just in a new form.
Well, and a big part of this is how multifaceted this attack is, right? Because when we're talking about this history of critical race theory, as both of you have done so expertly, it's tied to all these other different movements. The previous panel, I think, did a wonderful job of tying it to anti-trans bills, right? Waves of homophobia and anti-LGBTQ violence, the looming Dobbs opinion that we had the draft of, and we have more concerns over the secrecy of the court rather than the future of reproductive rights and justice in the United States. But with all these different connections, to take a focus on race in particular, how does this impact different racialized communities, or how do we see the intersections occurring there? Right? Because Emily mentioned at the beginning, the killing of Vincent Chin, right, as an untold story of racial justice. When Ian talked about the killing of George Floyd on video as a slow motion killing that led and precipitated all this uprising, right, and protest. So then how do we tie together these kind of disparate threads of revolution or, radical thinking, whether or not they actually are radical is another open question, but different ways of thinking about it. We're thinking about theories of social change and futures of, what is possible on the contrary side, right? Since we've talked so much about these attacks on critical race theory and the harm that's being done to communities of color generally, where do we see it on the flip side at the intersections of race in particular, where, how does can race provide us a way out of these problems rather than racism that is oppressing us in general?
Yeah, great question. I want to answer that by building on Emily's comments and in some ways sort of restating them, but then building on them, because there's so much that I agreed with there that I think just to reiterate the points that Emily was making. And I think especially for this audience, education, K through 12, but higher education, but sort of higher education as well, is under intense attack right now. Why? So one answer is this sort of the way in which, starting with Nixon, the party of big business sought to recast itself. The party of big business sought to recast itself as, in fact, a populist party. That right, the Republicans said, hey, we're the party of big business. Democrats, they're sort of New Deal, labor, civil rights. Starting with Nixon, party of big business seeks to recast itself as populist. What does it do in order to accomplish that? It shifts people's imagination about who the elites are. It pushes people to stop thinking about the billionaires, the oligarchs, the CEOs, the Chamber of Commerce, Wall Street, the financiers. It says those aren't the elites. The real elites are the cultural elites, the intellectual elites, the knowledge producers. It's the professors, it's the journalists, it's Hollywood. They're the elites. And those elites look down their nose at you. They're condescending. They hate you. You should punch up at these intellectual, at these cultural elites while ignoring the power of the business elites. And nobody better sort of embodies this than Donald Trump, the populist. So here's somebody who boasts of being a billionaire, who inherited large sums of money, who's always been engaged in sort of the highest echelons of America's like rapacious capitalism. And he turns around and he says, me, I'm a common man because, you know, I hate Black Lives Matter and I want to build a wall on the southern border. And, you know, and look, there's a disabled person in the audience. I will mock how they talk, right? Like he, you know, and journalists, fake news, fake media, hate them, right? This is classic Nixonian reconstitution of who the elites are. Okay, so that's one thing that's happening. Another thing that's happening is that education is under attack because education at the K through 12 and at the higher education level is now post-civil rights associated with racial integration, as Emily mentioned, right? So this is like, so there's this huge racial dynamic here. And I think the earlier panel really emphasized this. You can draw a very strong through line from hysteria over Brown versus Board of Education, to segregation academies, to attacks on public education, to the funding of private education and charter schools, right? So there's this huge racial component. Next thing that's happening, and again, this is to reiterate one of Emily's points, education plays an incredibly important role in the installation of civic virtues, the virtues that facilitate critical thinking and that communicate the value of a secular attachment to a multiracial, multi-religious democracy. That happens through education, right? And there's always been an opposition to it within sort of the evangelical tradition, which is hostile to the notion that government should be secular, that government should take into account the existence of a multi-religious or religiously heterogeneous population, but also this idea that we ought to be taught critical thinking skills. I mean, and just, you know, to translate these out of academic terms, we're all reared in households suffused with worldviews. What is it that equips us to evaluate the worldviews that we absorbed by osmosis and make our own judgments about those worldviews, and to simultaneously engage in a respectful and curious way with the worldviews of others who are quite different from us? That's what we mean when we say critical education, right? To be able to think critically about one's own origin stories and the origin stories and orientations of others. Okay. Also under attack. Last, and I think this is really important, education is under sustained attack because of who teachers are as a political and labor group, right? Like teachers as possessors of critical thinking skills are in the main committed to a progressive politics of a society that values equality, that shuns hierarchy, that sees an important role in government in providing safety net routes of upward mobility, mechanisms to foster an integrated, respectful, secular society, right? That's who teachers are in the main. They tend to vote Democrat. They very often are union members. They're strong supporters of unions. Breaking the political power of teachers, and especially of public school teachers and higher education teachers, that's its own agenda. Okay, so I've said four things here. Attack education to reframe who's elite. Attack education out of a sort of a racial panic about integration. attack education as a source of the inculcation of civic virtues, attack education as a sort of a home base for a politically powerful cohort. Going through that list of 4, one of those is centrally concerned with race, but 3 of them are not. In 3 of them, the sort of new elite, the civic virtues, the labor power and political power of teachers, racism is a convenient weapon wielded in pursuit of these ulterior motives. And here, to pick up something Emily also said, we should look seriously at racial capitalism, at the economic elites and their interests, or to put a different term on it, the Chamber of Commerce. And here I'm thinking very much of like the Chamber of Commerce and the Powell memo in the early 1970s saying, here's what we ought to do to infiltrate and to corrupt higher education. But the Chamber of Commerce has an agenda: shift people's attention to cultural elites and away from business elites, break people's commitment to the idea that society ought to be structured to help the vast majority rather than the rich, break the political power of teachers. How does it go about achieving those ulterior goals? Through a strategic use of racial division that also then gains emotional power and force because of people's hysteria over integration. I think it's very important as an analytic move that we look at racism and then look also behind racism, that we look at racism in its white over non-white, hierarchical, fear of integration, a dehumanization, degradation, and humiliation of people of color aspects. That's very much what's happening here. And that we also look behind it to ask, who's pursuing this and why are they pursuing it so aggressively? Why is so much money coming into this? Why is so much power coming into this? And to pick up on the Chris Rufo story, Rufo was a nobody. He was a sort of right-wing wannabe gadfly out of, Washington State. Then he gets picked up by Tucker Carlson, a multimillionaire who shills for billionaires, given a platform on Fox News, operated by the Murdochs, then embraced by Donald Trump, this billionaire faux populist. Rufo is then rewarded with a position as a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Well, what's the Manhattan Institute? It's a dark money funded organization that promotes policies that are favorable to the oligarchy. It's all about economic policies favorable to rule by the rich. Why are they hiring this guy who attacks critical race theory and boasts on Twitter that he's lying and that he's making all that shit up? Because they know that they cannot successfully win power by going to the American public and saying, hey, y'all should vote for rule by the rich. So that's not what they say to the American public. Instead, they go to the American public and say, hey, parents need to be able to protect their children from radical critical race theory crazies who are teaching your children to hate little white children and to hate the country, right? That is, as an analytic move, we have to see that racism is more than just white over non-white hierarchy. And that very often, and especially intensely right now, and for the last half century, especially intensely for the last half century, racism is the main weapon in the class war the rich are winning. Racism is the main weapon in the class war the rich are winning. That's what's been happening to us. You might say to yourself, well, listen, after the civil rights movement, after we made so much progress, how do we end up here with Donald Trump 50 years later? And I think a lot of people are implicitly asking that question, and then they implicitly answer by saying, we had no idea how deeply internalized white racism is. That's not good enough as an answer. That's part of it. But to really understand why white racism is so virulent right now, you have to look at Fox News. You have to look at the party of big business. You have to look at the Kochs and the Scafeys and the Mercers and the other dark money plutocratic funders of groups like the Manhattan Institute and the Heritage Foundation that shill on behalf of the oligarchs, but do so by promoting hysteria about race, right? That to really understand where we are in 2022, you have to look beyond the sort of a generic white racism and to say, who's promoting this, who's fertilizing it, who's fueling it, who's funding it, and what are their motives? Now, I'm going to pause there because I've said a lot. I do think this has dramatic implications for social movement building and for what we're doing as teachers and for this sort of evolution of critical race theory. But I want to pause there just because I really want to leave people with this idea that analytically, or maybe to tie it back to my earlier remarks, when we think now of the social construction of race, it is incredibly important not to treat racism as if it somehow exists outside of society, that it has its own force, its own logic, its own dynamics, and that we should look at racism largely, almost exclusively, in terms of racial group relations. That's an analytic mistake. We should see, we should examine, we should seek to discover how racism works in society, connected to the interests of economic elites, connected to the interests of political elites, as a way of organizing society in which racism is not the goal, it's the weapon, it's the tool, right? That's the sort of this, and I think that the phrase racial capitalism is very, very helpful. Our economic and political system is structured by and rationalized by racist ideology. And I'll say one comment there and then stop. A lot of people hear the term racial capitalism and understand it in terms of how capitalism especially exploits people of color. That's a very important element of it, but that's not the main point I'm making here. The main point I'm making here is capitalism in the United States, as it works for everybody, has been structured and rationalized by anti-Black, anti-people of color racism.
So, Ian, thank you for that. I think so the kinds of connections that I think are being made in this conversation is what theory actually is for, right? And so I think that as we continue to theorize about social movements and race, I actually think that we need to take it to the next level. You know, we need to take it to the sort of Powell memo, Koch level, and figure out how to do that by sort of by making these kinds of connections that Ian is making. And I think that we really have to recognize that racism or racist ideas are not specific only to certain groups of people, right? But that racist ideas operate as like a mechanism of control, and as a mechanism of domination in service to the self-interest of elites, or the self-interest of the ruling classes. And it just keeps doing that over and over again. One thing that was really inspiring to me from attending, the last weekend's program, which I talked about at the beginning of my comments, was to hear these kind of old-time activists talking on stage about coalition, how to work in coalition together, and how to deal with sort of intra-racial and inter-ethnic conflict and racism, and on stage, there was an East Asian American activist, a Middle Eastern Arab American activist, a Jewish American activist, a Black activist. Detroit is actually a really diverse place. And the way in which they were talking about sort of the necessity to connect the dots to work in coalition was amazing to me. And it's not the kind of thing that we do enough of as academics in sort of thinking and theorizing about how to do that. I think we really need to look to the work on the ground, to take us to the next level. I don't exactly know, how to do that, but I think that just because I don't know how doesn't mean, like I shouldn't try or other people shouldn't try. This is really important. And, it's the divide and conquer is such an old play, right? I mean, when I'm thinking about like just in Hawaii, right, Ian, like with respect to plantation owners and the way they would like divide, right, Filipinos and Chinese and Japanese and Koreans, and Black plantation workers to prevent collective action. One thing that really interests me, I know I'm kind of all over the place here, but one thing that really interests me lately, because I've just started to teach labor law, is to see where things go with the Amazon labor union, right? A union that sort of came out of nowhere, that didn't have the support of mainstream labor, that was multiracial in its organizing, led by people of color. The history of unionism has demonstrated that unions are most effective, labor is most effective when it is multiracial. Unions have a long history of being actually quite racist, but I'm, really interested in looking at this movement and thinking about why and how it's worked in sort of thinking through just sort of like strategies for moving forward, how race can be used, how sort of thinking about race can be used, right, to get beyond this point, this really terrible point that we're at.
Sorry, I hope you don't mind. Let me say something a little bit about unions. So, unions have long understood that racism is a divide and conquer tactic, but then often they've responded by saying, if racism's just the tactic, let's build solidarity on the basis of what unifies us all. Let's build solidarity on class issues, and let's suppress attention to race and racism, right? So there's this move, which is very common, which says, if the main enemy we face are the economic elites and racism's this tactic that they use, stop talking about race, because race is divisive. It divides the working class. It's intended to divide the working class. Let's just all come together on the basis of class issues. And that's never worked. Why has that never worked? It's never worked because people do want to know where they belong in society. They want to know if they're respected and esteemed. They want to know how to see these other people that seem different than them, different physically, different culturally, in terms of language, in terms of foods. And the ruling class, the power elites, are constantly telling people the most immediate threat in your life comes from these people who look different from you, your neighbors. They're pathologically violent. They're undeserving. They're coming to tear you down, to take your job. People are being bombarded with that message. And it simply doesn't work to say, yeah, but we're not going to talk about that. Let's talk about our shared economic interests. It doesn't work. So the AFL-CIO, I was working with them. I co-chaired their Racial and Economic Justice Advisory Committee. I've more recently been working with SCIU. They've really come to understand that they need to move from a race is a weapon, therefore we should be colorblind approach to race is a weapon, therefore we need to be anti-racist to build power for all racial groups approach. And I want to emphasize that, because this is it is in practice a very powerful way for organizing both labor movement members, but also for mobilizing democratic or progressive voters. The move is to say racism is a weapon that threatens all of us, and therefore we must purposefully build connections, power, and understanding across lines of racial division so that we can take care of our own families, whether we're brown or black, Asian American or Muslim American or white. Right. And so so this is this very, very important point. It's saying, and I'm going to focus on white folks in particular, it's saying to white folks, anti-racism does not pull down the status of white people. It allows white people to build power with others so that they can actually defend their status and their interests against the real enemy, the new oligarchs who increasingly rule our society. Right. So this is the move. And within the SEIU in particular has essentially said they won't support any political candidate who isn't talking in the language of a multiracial democracy in which we recognize racism as a divide and conquer tactic and purposefully build cross-racial connection and cross-racial power, right? Likewise, you can see this in the efforts of the Reverend William Barber and his reinvigorated poor people's movement. Reverend Barber, coming out of the tradition of the Black church, initially came to multiracialism as a moral imperative, as a religious imperative, but increasingly he talks about it as a pragmatic imperative. Increasingly, he's saying racism is being strategically used to break our political power. The solution is not ignore racism. The solution is actively repudiate it, build cross-racial power and understanding, work together so that all of us, whatever our race, white people included, can use anti-racism to take care of our own families, right? And so this is the, you see it in these efforts. There's another group that I love, a People's Action, that is trying to organize rural America. And People's Action, so rural America is a large non-white population, but predominantly white. People's Action initially thought, well, if we're going to organize rural America, we have to talk about the class interests of farmers, the class interests of small town America, where wealth and power is shifting away. There's, so many problems with healthcare, with drug addiction, with deindustrialization, with unemployment. We're going to talk about class issues. And every time they'd make some progress on the class issues, they then run headlong into a sort of a common sense of racial resentment as an explanation for the hardship in people's lives. That it's the immigrants, it's the urban poor siphoning away all the resources. And People's Action understood that, practically speaking, there was no way forward in rural America without addressing anti-Black racism, anti-Latino, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Asian racism, and the way in which it was being intentionally used to blind people to the real source of threat in their lives. So again, in all of these different levels, once we see clearly that racism is the main weapon in the class war the rich are winning, it provides a different way to talk about multiracial organizing, a way that is rooted in morality, that says anti-Black, anti-people of color racism is deeply immoral and tainted and ugly, and that is simultaneously rooted in practical politics. You want to take care of your family, no matter what race you are, no matter, and this I think really applies to a lot of folks who we think of, we might categorize as people of color, but who are themselves seeking status by distinguishing themselves from African Americans, for example. This is a dynamic within the Asian American community, within the Latino community. I think it also bears mention, 1 out of 5 African Americans are themselves immigrants or the children of immigrants. And there's very much a dynamic in among that community of saying, yeah, but I'm not one of those Blacks. I just got here. My family just got here, right? Like, there's all sorts of people seeking status and encouraged to seek status by embracing a racist ideology that dark is dangerous and undeserving. To speak effectively to those folks, as well as to all of us fighting for racial justice, we need to say racism is so virulent and violent right now because it's a weapon of the rich being used against all of us. Some of us are more directly targeted, some of us much more intensively harmed, but we all lose when the rich promote racism and laugh all the way to the bank. Join together with others. Yeah, it's the right thing to do, but more importantly, it's the only way you're going to be able to save your family.
Such a brilliant and beautiful conversation that you both are having right now. So many connections are firing my brain, especially thinking about the attacks on education in particular that you both talk so extensively about, and now the connection to coalition building and labor unions. I'm reminded of the fact that we were going through a major teachers strike before the pandemic happened and took the focus on education away from teachers and schools to remote learning, distant education. And where will the teachers unions come in now that we are back to in person? There are health dangers, there are racism dangers, there are gag orders. You know, the coalition's potential is limitless, I think. Especially when we frame it in the way that you're doing right now, Professor Haney-Lopez.
And I think that the right took COVID as an opportunity to demonize teachers and teachers unions, to say to parents, see, these folks don't actually care about your children, right? As if like Betsy DeVos and the Koch brothers really do care about your children, but the attacks on education, they're intense, they're purposeful, they're strategic, and they're incredibly well funded.
Yes. And I think thinking about education, not just in the general sense, but also maybe the institution and the sites, to try and tie together some of the questions we've got from our wonderful viewers today. But, you know, as sites of education, those have been the sites of school shootings that we've seen so rampantly. And how are these kind of racial wedge politics, diversion tactics tied to, you know, the school as a site, but then also the school as an institution, or institutions of higher education in particular? Are these institutions so tied to donations and plutocratic support removed from the public trust that how can they facilitate these types of critical conversations, or, you know, support for critical race theory beyond what, you know, supporting academics who do that work?
That's such a good question. And, you know, K through 12 teachers, as Ian referenced, are, you know, one of the biggest public sector union, right? One of the biggest public sector unions, along with police and firefighters. You know, I just want to talk for a minute about like university faculties, because, you know, I work at a state university. I don't leave a single faculty meeting. I don't get a single update from our provost that doesn't push us on generating revenue through our programming. I'm so tired of it. You know what I mean? Like, but it is, you know, we are constantly being told that we will not survive if we don't become more entrepreneurial and capitalistic in terms of the way that we go about doing our work. And it's just, it's to me, it's just infuriating. Like our university, it's already left, that train has left the station. You know, like we don't get to talk about sort of like, well, what happened to, you know, the public and collective good? And we are a unionized faculty. You know, we're a collective. Our chapter of the American Association of University Professors is a collective bargaining chapter. We're currently in the midst of contract negotiations right now, and we're about to go to mediation over issues relating, of course, to what else? Healthcare, right? Healthcare costs and wage increases or salary increases. I had a place that I was going with this, and I was suddenly kind of lost track. What was your what exactly was your question again?
So 2 levels to the question. One, schools as sites, particularly sites of harm, but then also schools as institutions, can they facilitate these types of critical conversations in critical race theory?
Yes, I think they can. And in part, I think they can because our students demand it, or they should demand it, you know? And so what Cheryl and Dorothy were talking about in the last session was about sort of like, you know, children see things, they observe things, they observe the fact and the reality of inequity and inequality that is racialized, right? Or that it's based on sort of, you know, other kinds of things, but they see those things, they ask questions. We need to be able to talk to them about that, or teach them how to think about those things that in a way that doesn't naturalize, right? Naturalize inequity based on sort of who the people are. But in higher ed, you know, we need to appeal to our students actually too, who can bring a lot of power to this, because increasingly I am finding, and in part this is due to, I think, you know, the sort of neoliberalization of the university, that our students like don't have any idea what it is that we do, you know? And that is a huge problem. You know, they're not, you know, the sort of liberal arts education that so many students used to get going through university has been replaced by sort of credentialing and competency and things like that. And, you know, we need to bring them into this fight, that this is not in their best interest, right? That's a very short-sighted type of education that they're getting, and bring them in, because, you know, I know one thing that administrations will listen to: two groups, not faculty, students and alumni, you know? And so I really think we need to bring students into some of the struggle.
I want to pick up on this idea that it's something that students are demanding. And I think that that's absolutely right. You know, in my decades of teaching, I've never seen a sort of a more, I want to say activist, but that's not quite the right word. Students with a sense of social crisis,
yes,
as opposed to students who are complacent, right? So I've taught decades of complacent students, but the students I'm teaching now, they know that our major social, political, and economic systems have failed. They know. They know that our democracy is on the cusp of failure. They know that our economic system has created a new oligarchy and immiseration for, you know, half the country. They know that our political system is so hamstrung, it cannot solve the existential threat of environmental collapse. They know these things, and they want to know why, and they want to know what they can do about it. And they may not be politically activists in the sort of in the street sense, but they're bringing these really big picture questions with them and making those demands on teachers. And I think to the extent that teachers are sort of, you know, on this apolitical, we're just here to learn this narrow subject, we're not answering the big questions, I think the students find that enormously frustrating, and more power to the students. Keep making your teachers uncomfortable. Here's the other thing I think that this implies. It's very important for us as teachers to keep in mind the role we play in instilling civic virtue. Right? And precisely because our students are being told, and our politicians are saying, the role of higher education is to add to people's ability to make money across their lives. So, you know, students are consumers. Higher education is a marketplace. We have to generate our own revenue. We have to justify our revenue generation by being able to document increased capacity to make money across people's lives. I was so disappointed when the Obama administration, Department of Education, did a ranking of higher education, and the most important metric they used was how much it increased people's lifetime earning capacity.
Yeah.
Right? It really emphasized this sort of students are consumers. This is a marketplace. This is a financial transaction. We as teachers need to emphasize education and critical thinking is foundational to our ability to reflect on our own lives, to engage in a just and respectful and dignified way with others, and to help create the sort of the conditions of a progressive humanistic society that actually takes care of people, right? That's what we're trying to do. I think in the specific context of critical race theory, it becomes very important for us as teachers to be mindful of the way in which we set the conditions for, we hold up examples of anti-racist, racially egalitarian, cross-racial solidarity. Now more than ever, our students are being told on all sorts of levels, racial conflict is inevitable and some racial group will dominate over others. Choose your team. And it becomes incumbent on us to insist to the students that that's a massive lie, that racially egalitarian cross-racial solidarity is possible, that in some settings, some limited settings, it's been achieved, but that even more, it is the prerequisite to us surviving as a democracy, to us recreating an economically just society. And frankly, a racially egalitarian democracy in the United States is a prerequisite to avoiding global climate collapse. We ought to be saying that as teachers. That's something that we ought to say to students all the time and help them model. What does a racially egalitarian cross-racial solidarity look like? And what does it demand? How does it help all of us, no matter our racial group?
All right, I had to write that down. That was very powerful.
No, 100% agree.
I think, especially summing it up to as we're reaching the end of our allotted time here, there's such an important piece of this that goes into that coalition building and solidarity piece that we so often get lost and caught up in on the, especially when we're in defense mode, right? We started this conversation with our personal stories of how we came to critical race theory. And then we're talking about the attacks on critical race theory. And obviously, in a society that has elites in power who expressly do not want these conversations on race to happen, right? For different, capital motivated reasons, for power motivated reasons, right? It obfuscates the hierarchy and subordination that's going on, right? And so then to have these conversations about personal histories and have these conversations about how we reach education and critical race theory is just a beautiful thing to be a part of. So thank you to you both for bringing that expertise and bringing that conversation to all of us who are in the audience today. And I also wanted to, in the final minute, say thank you, especially to our interpreters who have provided such a vital role to this conversation, an unheralded piece in the corner here that is just beautiful to see. Thank you to all the tech support people behind the scene, especially thank you to Chris Wright for providing the questions for today, and for the organizers for really bringing everybody together and giving us this chance to have this conversation and hopefully continue those conversations of solidarity beyond our little, hour and a half window we had here today.
Thank you all. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Jeremiah, for facilitating a really great conversation. Thanks, Ian. And thanks, everyone.